Tough meat. You can't always have filet mignon. So how do you take a tough cut of beef and tenderize it? In this video, I'm going to try to explain and showcase different cooking techniques, how they work, why they work, and when do they work best. Hi, my name's Tom, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. And if you found this video informative, helpful, or entertaining, please consider subscribing, joining our patrons, or channel memberships for additional perks. Now back to the video. I have a couple different cuts of meats. We have a really lean piece of meat that's often used for beef stew, and we have chuck, which is often used for a chuck roast. The chuck roast has more fat and more marbling, and the beef stew meat is extremely lean. We're going to run a little experiment later on, where I'm going to take the chuck roast and the beef stew, but we're going to group them in groups of 3. The first group is going to be nothing at all. We're just going to season them with salt and pepper right before we cook them on the grill. The second group will be marinated overnight, and the last group will be marinated and sous vide. And then we're going to fire up the grill and we're going to see what the results look like. But before we get to that, let's talk about different cuts of beef. For the average consumer, it all starts at your grocery store or your favorite butcher. When you order a very specific cut of beef, it's coming from a very particular part of the animal. The star of our show, the cow, has certain muscles that the animal uses much more frequently, that are tougher, like the chuck or the shoulder, and other muscles that are less frequent, that are tender yet fatty, and very tender yet lean muscles, like the tenderloin, that are used much less often. So what does a piece of steak look like? Well, red meat or skeletal muscles consist of muscle fibers, fat cells, and connective tissues. And in the absence of fat cells, really lean cuts of meat tend to have more protein strands, which are often very curly and intertwined. And that's why certain cuts of meat are just better off used in stews, but we'll get to that in a second. As I mentioned earlier, a really easy thing that you can do that a lot of people neglect is marinating your meats overnight. So why do chefs marinate their meat? And what exactly is going on? Well, a marinade usually consists of acids, oils, and spices, or flavoring. Acids work to soften and flavor the meat by denaturing it. When proteins are denatured, they create pockets in the meat where flavor enters. Those acids will enter into the protein fibers and help denature and soften tough cuts of meat. Protein strands are naturally tight and they curl into each other. By adding some acid, the strands unwind and unfold. A great marinade acts to tenderize the meat and add loads of flavor. Keep in mind, to tenderize really tough cuts of meat, you want to marinate for at least 3 hours. Another great option is braising. Certain cuts of meat sometimes are just better off slowly cooked, whether that's slowly wet cooked, like chilies, stews, or birria, or slowly dry cooked. Think barbecue grill, low and slow, cooking up a brisket, for example. What's the difference between braised meat and stewing recipes like beef stew? Braising uses just enough liquid to come halfway to 3/4 of the way up the meat. Stewing, on the other hand, submerges the food in liquid. Think like a soup or a chili. Stews also generally call for meat to be cut into smaller, uniform-sized pieces, whereas braised meat can be left whole, in their original roast form. Let's go back for a second. What is braising? And how should you use it? When should you use it? Braising can actually be a hard technique to master at first because it tests your understanding of multiple different cooking techniques. You start off by searing the food in a small amount of oil to caramelize the outside, browning and crisping up the exterior without cooking the meat all the way through. Then you add liquid. It can be a broth, wine, beer, cider, or even water, and simmer the meat over gentle heat for hours until it becomes soft and tender. Lastly, controlling your temperatures. And the ultimate way to control your temperatures is through sous vide. Sous vide is a great way to get edge-to-edge doneness, but it's also a great way to tenderize your meat. You see, you can never theoretically overcook your food using sous vide because of thermodynamics. The water temperature will never exceed your set doneness or the internal temperature of the food. You can, however, cook your food longer than it would usually take. For example, your steak may take 30 minutes to get to medium rare. You can cook it for 36 hours, and that's way more than it would actually need to be done. And what that does is help break down the protein fibers, which will ultimately help tenderize your meat. There is such a thing as overdoing it though. One time I experimented with sous vide and cooked something for 5 straight days. And let me tell you, it really grossed me out. Now, the sous vide didn't turn the steak into mashed potatoes or anything like that, but the steak had this really weird texture where even after I seared it, there was still some solid crunch to it and crispiness, but overall, it was just a lot easier to chew, but not in a good way. Sous vide is quite simple yet very innovative. The hot water in a container is circulated around the bags for a gentle cooking process that slowly brings the temperature of the ingredients up to, but not past, the temperature of the water. This makes it a much more precise cooking method than other heating methods such as your oven or stovetop. When you sous vide, you can reach the ideal temperature for enzymes to break down tough protein strands without reaching a high enough temperature for the food to dry out. This leaves you with meat that's incredibly tender and juicy. Okay, now it's time to run through the experiment. We have the 3 categories that I mentioned before, and making sure to take a sample size of both the stew meat and the chuck roast. The first category was seasoned just before we hit the grill with salt and pepper. The second category was marinated overnight, and finally the third category was also marinated, but this time it was sous vide for 36 hours. I took all the meat and put them in kebab form, making sure to always keep them separate from one another because I didn't want the higher fat content from the chuck roast to influence the stew in any way. For this test, I decided to fire up my gas grill to make sure I had complete control over the heat, and we cooked up each kebab, shooting for medium rare. So I kind of knew what to expect already. I knew that the stew meat was going to be tough, and it was going to be challenging to really tenderize it. But I was interested to see how well it did sous vide. And then I also knew that the seasoned meat right before grilling was going to be the toughest, so there was no surprises there. That's exactly what it was. The chuck meat was slightly better because of the fat content. Now, when we marinated the meats overnight, the stew meat did get better, but still wasn't my favorite, and I definitely wouldn't reach for it. The chuck meat improved greatly. It had loads of flavor. The fat content was able to absorb a lot of that marinade, and the acids from the marinade did break down the protein fibers a bit. And I was able to notice a difference. It was a bit more tender. Now, sous vide was a completely different story. Both the stew meat and the chuck roast were noticeably way more tender and loaded with flavor because that marinade was there the entire process while they're being sous vide. Now, I gotta tell you, the stew meat was a lot more tender, and it was definitely doable. Dare I say, almost enjoyable. Still wouldn't be my first choice for kebabs, but if I was in a pickle and all I had was stew meat, I think I can pull it off. The chuck roast, however, this is how I'm going to make kebabs going forward. If I'm not going to be using tenderloin and I'm going to be using chuck, I'm going to make sure I sous vide them ahead of time because they were a lot more tender. Now, of course, there are other ways to tenderize meat, but in the interest of time, I could not go through all of them. Worth mentioning though are pressure cookers. Pressure cookers are a great way to cook tough meat and tenderize them really fast. There's also some tenderizers that you can buy, or you can add some baking soda to your marinade if you're in a hurry. A final note, methods used in the past when you really didn't know any better are not recommended. And likewise, I can't advocate for you beating your meat if you're into that. That's it for me, guys. I hope you found this video informative, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everybody.